reminder by his presence and his conversation that the events involved in the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom were not long past. He was already in his 80s when we met, and as many of those of you who know him know, both his mother's mother and his father's mother were very closely connected with the Queen, and I'm sure that many of you heard him tell these stories, but to bring Kekuni's stories back for a minute. On the walls of his house was a painting of the Hawaiian flag given to his maternal grandmother by Liliuokalani herself, who was paying for the grandmother's education, as she did for the education of a lot of young girls. When his grandmother married a white ship captain, the painting was hung on the inside of a closet door where it couldn't be seen, and the children and grandchildren forbidden to talk about it, which is why we have to talk about it now, is what Kekuni would say. His other grandmother was one of the Queen's huas, living on the grounds of her estate in Waikiki, now the Marriott, a site that was so painful to him that he did not want to go there, like to go there, I don't know if he ever did, but he didn't like to go there, even to hear Aaron Mahi's trio play the songs that Liliuokalani wrote on that spot. It makes me too sad, is what he told me. So Kekuni was an expansive thinker, but he was also a stickler for precision. I don't think he saw any of the pages I'm going to read tonight, but he saw others, and they always came back with little penciled notes in a delicate hand, always demanding greater accuracy or subtlety or understanding. And I have no doubt that if he were here tonight, as I really wish he were, he would do the same with anything that I might need to say. Besides Kekuni, I didn't say that I live in Oregon, so it's really been as an outsider that I've, in many ways, that I've dropped into this work. But there are many people who have helped me find my way in Hawaiian history, archivally, intellectually, politically, or spiritually. Some warmly and personally, others just through their work, and some, as in the case of Tom, they're both Meliana. The scholarship that's making it possible, not only for Hawaiians, but for other people, to begin to comprehend the brilliance and resilience of Hawaiian culture was really heroic intellectual work. And there is an ever-broadening library of this work. I guess you're hearing some of it in these series, and Lynette shares others of it in her TV series. I have to just tell you, too, just a word about the strong Hawaiian community in Portland, which has made it possible for me to retain at least some sense of connection to Hawaii when I'm home. That community has had a lot of losses this year. Most centrally, a woman named Diva Yamashiro. I don't know if any of you know Diva, but she was the founder of an organization called the Keikakui Foundation in Vancouver, Washington, right across the river, and sponsored many language classes, dance classes, and among many, and she actually, I have to say that Diva's cultural power in Vancouver, not only in the Hawaiian community, but beyond, and she created a tremendous amount of recognition for the Hawaiian community of the Northwest through her work in Vancouver. She was the sponsor of a Northwest group troupe for Kalei Maile reenactment that I was part of. Was thrilled to be able to play the journalist Miriam Michelson. I recognize you from seeing you here. Okay? Yeah. I've loved Miriam's words. I especially have always loved it's the old battle, the white man against the brown, might against right, strength against weakness. I have to say that every time I came to the place where I had to say, without ruining it, Mrs. Gaellin Campbell, I would panic. It was very hard to say it without breaking the rhythm of what I have to say. And I have to mention too, my very close friend, Alice Gaellin Millam, who is dying of pancreatic cancer in California as we meet. Mainstay of the Maile Alii troupe, among many other things. She sort of played Keanu, so she did Keanu's talk and used his PowerPoint after our performances. We were jointly students in a little, very tiny Hawaiian language class taught by our friend Alii Byrne, who in turn began her language studies here with Tuti Haley, and until very recently, and will again, I think, comes back to dance with Juana de Silva. So these are very real ties. There are not enough of them, but they are sustaining to those people, and they can pass some of that sustenance on to others. So I'm going to stop these introductory comments by telling you how I got into this work in the first place. And basically, it started on a family trip to Maui. It was my first trip to Hawaii in 1995. I am not someone who usually hears voices, but I was reading a guidebook that said something like, in 1893, a group of American back planters overthrew the Queen, and they all lived happily ever after. It was essentially, that was the equivalent. And a voice in my head literally said, no way. It just didn't happen like that. When I got home, I began reading Hawaiian history and eventually began the deeper research that led in time to meeting Kekuni and to the nation piece. And all the years that I've been working on trying to tell the Queen's story since. So I often watch Lynette's fascinating interviews with the scholars doing this remarkable new work in Hawaiian history. Many with very deep ancestral roots and deep knowledge of them. My own genealogy, which is mostly lost in the very different tragedies of Eastern European Jewish history, provides no connections, indeed no genealogical connections to Hawaii, whatever. Not being Hawaiian is a great gap. It's an unbridgeable gap. I suspect that some of you in this room, in some sense, know or can know Queen Liliuokalani better than I ever will, no matter how much I try, how many years I try. And I have no doubt either that there are Hawaiian resources, Hawaiian language resources, unknown to me or impenetrable by me, even if I did know them, that would alter or at least enrich whatever portrait of the Queen I am able to come up with. And I think that will happen. I think a Hawaiian writer, Hawaiian scholar will be producing such a thing in time, but it's a time-consuming thing, obviously. All I can say is that when I heard that voice on Maui all those years ago, I listened, and I'm very grateful to the Hawaiians who've helped me along the way. So that's a lot of introduction, but what I want to try to do tonight is introduce you not so much to Queen Liliuokalani, which would be impossible, but to a biography of Queen Liliuokalani, which is a very different thing. The Queen was a person, a human being like us, who actually woke up every morning and went to bed every night. Happy, sad, young, old, sick or well, every day in her case, for 79 years. A biography is a mere book, 300 or 400 pages. And if you want to think about unbridgeable gaps, think think about that one. A book goes forward and back, and you can pick it up anywhere. But a life goes inexorably forward, birth to death, quite independent of events the world may deem historic. Between the person and the book are the leavings of a life out of which a biography is necessarily made, the physical residue of a lifetime of changing personal relationships and changing political historical circumstances. If you just think for a moment about your own attics or trunks, okay, your own letters, your own scrapbooks, your own whatnots that probably include your grandmother's whatnots or whatever. I mean, you compare what your stuff to your actual life. You see, right away what's more complicated and rich and real. I mean, the material residue is not all we leave, or so we hope. And obviously, it is not all that was left by the Queen. But it is the place where a biography or any other attempted depiction of the Queen has to start. Not where it ends, but where it starts. So I want to tell you a little bit about the sources for reconstructing the Queen's life. The most important source is right over here in the archives, in this archive. And I don't know if any of you have done this kind of research or if you've seen it. I bet you have. Really, Tom has, I know. This is a finding aid that's over here. It's a public document. It's called M93. It's produced by the librarians over years. It's the central repository, really, of Lily O'Connor's leavings. They say it's 9 linear feet of papers, account books, and ledgers. It is full of treasures. Anybody prowling in them will find one, will be attracted to ones that seem particularly treasury to you. One that I liked right from the beginning is, you can see these, you can look at these afterwards, like untangle them. This is a sketch of her childhood that we know was written, the beginning of a sketch of her childhood we know was written well before the sketch in her, what she says about it in the autobiography, because, I'll say more about this in a minute, but because we know that it was in her archives, in her desk in 1895 when she was arrested and when Judd came and took all her papers. So there's also an interesting thing about this M93 is that the last 22 pages of it are the catalog made by the Chief Justice Judd on that day that she was arrested, and he went over to Washington Place and emptied her desk and her safe and bureau drawers and whatever they could find. And you might remember in the autobiography, she says that she saw Judd turning the corner to her house just as she was being taken away, and that the only document, this is the only document which has been returned to me is my will. So the second part of this is all those stolen documents. So it's a real window into the Queen's life as it was at that moment in 1895. One of my favorites I can't resist mentioning is Judd is the opposite of a professional librarian. He makes his own little comments on everything. And this document is his S26. His comment is, paper found crumbled up, obscene comments on cabinet and other officers of the government. So he's calling the Queen's document obscene, but what it really is, and come look at it afterwards, is she's telling who these guys really are. And here's somebody, Papa to a young Kanaka, keeps 2 girls someplace, they're what she knows about them. I mean, they're not obscene comments. There's also another one, is a letter from Charles Bishop that Judd says, good advice. So he doesn't keep his opinions out of here. Another big source is the Bishop Museum. There's a 53-page finding aid, much less accessible than the one over here. Within these collections and others, there are hundreds of pages of the Queen's letters and diaries. The letters, mainly, you have to go through all these things to find yourself, sort of hunting and pecking. The diaries, which have also been divided between the State Archives and the Bishop Museum, are now close to being, in process of being published in a comprehensive edition annotated by David Forbes. That will be a companion volume to his annotated introduction to Hawaii Story by Hawaii's Queen that came out a couple of years ago. Another source of biographical insight into the Queen is, of course, her songs, and how wonderful it would be if we could turn to them and come closer through them to her most intimate thoughts and experiences and feelings. If we could match a particular song to a particular private or political moment. In some cases you can, but in many other instances it is much more difficult to make the connections. And to go a step further, in some cases it is almost the reverse. That is that you have already to know the details of an incident or event before you can understand what she's saying about it in the song. In Noe Noe Silva's analysis of Ai na Kalani in Aloha Betrayed is a case in point. It's really interesting analysis of that song. Even the compilers of the songbook of Hui Hanai say of the beautiful Sanoe, they say, there is more to this text than meets the eye. In 100 years removed from the event and its principles, we can probably do little more than enjoy the song and wonder at its secrets. And I think that if they couldn't do more than that with Sanoe, I don't know if any biographer could, certainly not an English language biographer. And lastly, as sources with which a biography is made, there is the autobiography, which is a powerful and important literary and political achievement. And it's become a primary source for Hawaiian history in many instances. But from a biographical point of view, it's more limited than meets the eye because it is discreet, to say the least. You probably are all aware of the discreetness of her comments about her mother-in-law. So it has to be read as sort of a back and forth in a counterpoint with other sources that you might have that illuminate the same moment. She told a lot in Hawaii Story, that Hawaiian history and historiography would be much the weaker for her not having said, but she also kept a lot of secrets. So after all that, I'm going to turn to my book itself. The rest of this talk is going to be Reed's story. Okay, it's not so much Doc's story. But I just want to add a couple of further thoughts. And that is that the difference between these sources, these materials, that I think it's important to be aware of, for anyone to be aware that that's what a biography depends on. But the difference between that and these things in an actual biography is interpretation. There are no rules in biography for how to go from M93 to a page of your own.
There are really no rules in biography because every life is different and every weavings of a life are different, and every biographer has to struggle with what's the way to tell this story. A biography is not like an intact bowl found in some archaeological dig. It's more like something, it's tentatively reassembled out of the shards of the dig that the assembler can only hope bears some resemblance to the lost original. So what inner as well as outer forces really determined the shape of this life? What are its great themes? I would not even want to begin to tell you or to remember myself the variety, the variety of thoughts I've tried out as I've begun the work of interpretation of the life of the Queen, as I've looked through the themes that run through it. There's themes of power, there's themes of love. But I can tell you that the theme that I came to believe is greater than the others, and that is guiding my book, as I believe it did her life, is something that all 19th century Hawaiians, and indeed everyone who looked at Hawaii in the 19th century, came to know too well. And that is, very sadly, the theme of Hawaiian deaths. So I'm going to start off where my book starts. The book starts in 1848. After a prologue, it starts in 1848, which was known as Annum Mortuum, the year of death. And it's going to start right here, at December 30th, 1848, at the funeral. Lydia Kalani is 10. Lydia, and she's 10. On December 30th, 1848, toward the end of a series of epidemics that would cause the 1849 census to declare the past 12 months the Annum Mortuum, the year of death, a melancholy procession including the kings, the chiefs, important foreigners, and thousands of grieving natives assembled near the compound where the king had his home and made its way to the royal tomb known as Pohukaina for the burials of 3 more dead chiefs. They were 27, 18, and 3 years old. What pageantry accompanied the dead Alii to their graves? The soldiers, the feather standards, the flag, the king's band, its western march, and somber duet with the Hawaiians' wails. And how little these honors assuaged the dread that was in every Hawaiian heart. This is Kamehameha 3, quote. Official reports have reached me on the rapid decimation of the native race, which caused me a severe pang of sadness, staggering in its intensity, as the realization dawned upon me that this catastrophe facing the race spelt the death knell of Hawaii. The king, Kamehameha III, had cried out to his people a few years before. Now the decimation was a literal fact. Between the measles, whooping cough, and influenza which have raged among Hawaiians, it is estimated that not less than 10,000 have been swept away, or about 1/10 of the population, another source reported. The mausoleum itself held a different measure of loss, for though only a quarter-century old, the royal crypt was already too crowded. Unlike the chiefs who had died before them, whose caskets lay side by side, draped in satins and silks, today's dead would be buried in a single hole. Watching as the remains of 3 young relatives who were all part of her daily life were layered into the ground was a thoughtful 10-year-old member of the royal family, known at the time as Lydia, in her first mourning clothes, and the child was frightened. The dead were being stacked oldest first, and the one on top was her little sister. The crypt was dank and dark. A few years later, a mourner at another funeral wrote, "I never felt so subdued, so mortal, never obtained a clearer view of the end of all earthly power than in that tomb. And I believe the future Liliuokalani felt the same." Long after the bodies of the Alii had been moved to a larger resting place, and when the kingdom itself was dying, she paused in the writing of her autobiography in Washington, D.C., and remembered the scene. This is an example of this back and forth between, I don't know, biographical decision or instinct and what her clue, okay? You probably remember this if you study the book. She says, she talks about it. She says, "This sad event made a great impression upon my younger days, for these relatives and companions of my youth died and were buried on the same day. The coffin of the last name resting on those of the others." She talks about it a little more, but so here she is, she's in 1897 in Washington, and this is what comes to her when she reconstructs her childhood. And I didn't say that this is a portion of a long opening sequence. It's called Death and Dances. This portion of the book goes from 1848 to her marriage in 1862. It deals, among other things, with the chief's children's school, which is a story in itself, most of which I can't read, obviously, but this is the very first mention of Liliuokalani in written history, so in English language history, and I think that in Hawaiian history, in Hawaiian history, in oral history, there were name songs, birth songs, and so on. But this is how she appears. "We expect one new one in a week or two, a little girl not yet 3 years old," wrote missionary teacher Juliet Cook, who with her husband Amos was in charge of the boarding school for the next generation of chiefs, started by the mission at the request of the present chiefs, to her New England family in the summer of 1841 when the child mission was first proposed. "She will add much to my cares, already too heavy, but there seems no other way. The Catholics will have her if we do not take her. If she lives, she will be a high chief, and we feel as if we could not refuse her." Entering instead a year later, still under 4, the new one was scarcely more eager. "In the morning, Lydia came, but she soon began to cry for her kahu, and I let her go and told them to keep her until we were ready, and then we would take care of her," Amos noted in his journal on April 14th, 1842. It was another month, May 24th, 1842, before she spent the night. In a perfect biographical world, the writer would be able to follow the unwilling child through the door of the austere wooden building, watching her eat, sleep, play, and learn until she emerges 8 years later, reading, writing, and already enjoying what she would call one day the consolations of music. But unfortunately, there is almost no evidence. Unlike some of the other 15 chiefly boarders who appear frequently in the cook's journals and letters as being either very good or more often very bad, Lydia is seldom named, and when she is, the mention is always innocuous. On May 4th, 1843, she is with a teacher and another student when an axle breaks in their cart. On April 25th, 1844, she falls out of a wagon. By March 22nd, 1845, she can read Rollo's book, study Emerson's Arithmetic Part 1, and commit a verse of scripture daily. Sometimes she's on a list with the other children, So we know she weighed 44 pounds on February 24th, 1844, and 60 pounds on May 8th, 1847. But often, as between April 14th, 1845, when she was sick, and September 2nd, 1846, when Amos writes, "This is Lydia's birthday." The 8-year-old scholar, which is what Amos and Juliet called their charges, is not referred to at all. Nor, again in contrast to what is the case for several of the other scholars, have any of her own journals or other writings survived. When she pops up, as she does occasionally in the teacher-monitored journals of some of the older children, the mentions are just as unrevealing, containing only such logistical observations as that on an 1843 trip around Oahu, on which the older girls were on horseback, Lydia was on her little wagon, and on a trip the following year, while most of the other students were again on horses, Lydia and the young schoolmate closest to her in age were on the bier. So to try to understand her experience in the Chief's Children's School, you have to look at the school. You can't look at her because there is no evidence. And I'm not going to read this. There's too much to read. But the school was a place of great struggle between Amos and especially the older boys, and particularly Moses, who is the one who's being buried in this opening. He's buried here. Moses and Amos were really at war. Moses was very difficult and unsavable from Amos's point of view. He was always sneaking out. He wrote I don't know how much of this is widely known and how much isn't known at all, but he wrote a sort of escape story. The line that's always quoted from it is, I cannot live in the land of my birth, for they have shamed me, or something like that. Because he's always being punished by Amos Cook, and he's put in isolation. So you have to imagine what it was like to be a little girl while there's this big struggle between Amos and the older children. I think she decided to be a good girl, basically. And my concluding line of the part I'm not reading is, the lessons drawn by the young Alii varied according to their natures and times and must be read in their lives rather than in their words. But for the unobtrusive 9-year-old Lydia, who had managed never to bring any of that wrath on herself, it seems to have been something like one of the rules the children wrote in their journals: speak not too loud nor too low. As the influence of the missionaries determined the fate of the kingdom in more ways than anyone at the time could know, she became what she would remain until political circumstances required her to be otherwise, a good girl. But now we're going to go back to 1848, which also leads into the ending of the school. In the fall of 1848, as Lydia turned 10, the good and the bad, the young and the old, the converted and the unconverted, and the chiefs and the commoners alike were caught up together in the great waves of illness and death that reduced the population from 93,500 to 84,200 in the space of 24 months, and brought the school, along with everything else, to a standstill. Confirmed by Hawaii's leading modern statistician, the facts continue to horrify. The crude death rate was 88 per 100,000 inhabitants in 1848 and 50.5 the following year. Deaths outnumbered births by wide margins in both years.
Horrifying, too, are the experiences of those who lived through it. Some cases were distressing in the extreme, Juliet Cook wrote in a letter to Amos's family. One house on being entered was found to contain 4 dead bodies. They had perhaps starved to death, all sick at once and no one able to go for food. Another case of a man and woman occurred where there were other houses with people in them in the same yard. One remarked that their door always seemed to be shut and went to see if they were sick and found them locked in each other's arms, dead. Within the school itself, the atmosphere can only have been one of terror as news came in from outside the walls of whose father or cousin or kahu was now gone, and the children fell ill themselves, one after the other, no one knowing who would recover and who would die. This is from Amos's journal. James, Peter, Lydia, Emma, and Elizabeth have had their worst day. Most of the chiefs, which he sometimes called them the chiefs, were taken down yesterday. Amos recorded on October 24th, 1848, the first of a week of entries naming every child in the school until November 1st. David, the last, has been taken down today. As their servants failed too, both Amos and Juliet and the children, as they were able, took over the chores of milking, chopping wood, cooking, sweeping, and all the rest, when possible going out into town to deliver such medicines as they could contrive. But as for studies, the school was closed, its routines dominated by the sustained confrontation with death. Gravely ill in a house in the nearby royal compound lay Moses, 2 years gone from the school, but not from the lives of the royal children, nor from the mind of Amos Cook. On Friday morning, November 24th, hearing that Moses was worse, all the children went to see him, followed by Amos himself, who reminded him that Jesus Christ alone could afford him assistance. I hope so, Amos noted, that Moses replied. A few hours later, he was dead, preceded earlier that day by his loving Hanai mother, who had vowed not to outlast him. To all human appearances, he died as he had lived, without God and without hope. Amos. So far as he is concerned, we fear that our labor has been in vain, but we hope and pray that his untimely end may prove a blessing to the remaining members of his family and to the king and to his parents and to the chiefs generally. Amos wrote to his sister, invoking Psalm 52:23. The wicked shall not live out half their days. But it could not be a blessing to any Hawaiian. For more than a month, Moses' body lay in state beside those of 2 other young members of the royal family, with whom he would be buried when the gravediggers caught up with the dead. Leleohoku, 27, but in vice an aged man, Amos pronounced him, father of the young chief with whom Lydia was paired every Sunday for the walk to prayers. And this is a hard one for me, Ka'imina Ina A'o'o, 3, the sister of Lydia, and her older brothers David and James, who was to have joined them at the school shortly. Every day, some of the children went back and forth between school and palace, watching over the corpses and trying to comfort the king. At last, December 30th, 1848, came the great royal funeral that long after she was no longer Lydia, Leleo'ukalani would never forget. Moses was at the bottom of the hole, Leleohoku next, Ka'imina Ina A'o'oa, on top. As they stared down into the hole, dressed in their Christian best, the children who had been chosen by the waning generation of chiefs to guide the Hawaiian kingdom into the modern world can only have wondered who among them would live to rule and over whom they would rule if they did. Beside them, as they grieved, stood Amos Cook. They tried to display great pomp, but my soul loathed the whole affair, he wrote in his journal that day. Need water. I'm going to jump way ahead. First I'm going to make I guess it's a procedural comment about, or
comment about biography, and that is one of the most difficult and sort of fundamental acts of biography, and especially in the case of somebody as centrally involved in a great historical event as the Queen, is the periodization. What are the phases of the life, and what are the phases of any of our lives, and how do those phases fit with the political history? In the case of the Queen, obviously the political history has always dominated, and if you didn't really think about it, you'd think that her story began or began and ended almost with the overthrow, which of course we know is not the case. So that's, anyway, it's an essential act, and this comes from a much later, I want to read two pieces from a much later part of the book. So that section, the whole first section, is called Death and Dances. I told you this one. That's followed by a section that goes from 1862 to 1874. Her married life is called Mrs. Dominus. And now we're at something called Is This All There Are of You? It's essentially Kalakaua's reign. So it's 1874 to 1891, and the phrase "Is this all there is of you," which you'll hear in the text, is his spontaneous cry when he's on one of his royal tours. He's passing through a near empty village. It's in a letter, and he wonders why there are so few people there. So this is a chapter, and I don't think I've emphasized enough that this is a work in progress. So this chapter is certainly not in a final form, but it's called King and Brother, and it's about the relationship between the sister and brother. It begins with a letter to Kalakaua from Liliu in 1874, when he's in Washington. I had no idea that in the absence of one man there should be such a vacancy. And I must say that when you went away, there was a feeling of want for a man you could look up to and feel we had a head over us all. Liliu, not yet Liliu Kalani, wrote her brother in 1874 when the new king was in Washington, speaking to Congress about the Reciprocity Treaty and dining at the White House with President Grant. There had never been so much ocean between them. 2 years older, he had been there at the Chief Children's School when she entered as a tearful 4-year-old in 1842, and he had been there ever since. He was there when they buried their littlest sister and 2 cousins in stacked coffins in the same grave when she was 10, a day that would haunt her entire life. There when they lost their oldest brother, whom she mourned with shaved head and broken teeth a few years later. There at the deathbeds of their parents and at the probates of their shared inheritance. There at every death and funeral that drew them closer both to one another and to what they would each eventually become in the history of the Hawaiian kingdom. Both publicly and privately, their lives were inseparable. Lydia was together with the rest of the royal children when the kingdom was taken over by a British naval officer in February 1843. Together when the unauthorized action was decisively repudiated by another officer in July. Together at an official luncheon aboard the latter officer's ship that became another lifetime memory. The impact of the 1843 loss of sovereignty on the minds of all of the children who were to govern Hawaii cannot be overstated. You may have seen this quotation. The king feels as if he was a ruined man, and our scholars feel somewhat so, Schoolmaster Amos Cook reported to his family in Connecticut after the seizure. They tore off their gold hatbands from their caps and wished to take the buttons from their coats, saying as they were no longer chiefs, they did not wish to wear any insignia. But the kingdom had been restored. For 10 days following the raising of the Hawaiian flag on July 31st, The whole community gave itself up to festivities and rejoicing, and the day became a national holiday. On the 4th anniversary, July 31st, 1847, thousands of people, including Lydia, now 9, and David, 11, gathered at the second home of the king, Kamehameha III, to celebrate the restoration of the kingdom with an enormous feast. And of course, that's the occasion of the proclamation, of the pronouncement of the motto. At the time of this great exaltation, there was no such thing as a Kalakaua dynasty, and little likelihood that there would be one. And I'm going to skip all the Kamehameha genealogy and the elections of 1872 and again 1874, because you know all that. But it's done now. Now he's king. Now he was not only brother, but king. There is no doubt about the family's pleasure in coming out at last of the shadows of the Kamehamehas, and indeed coming out literally, for the king at once took up the royal kapu of burning torches in daylight, a right belonging only to rulers of exalted descent. Whereas other chiefs might have torches borne before them during the night, the blood of Kalakaua claimed the tributes of an unquenched flambeau both night and day, explained a newspaper account of his royal progress to Kauai soon after his accession. And from then on, his appearances were marked by blazing displays, always described by onlookers in words like stupendous. And it was not only the king who was elevated, it was all of them, Nalani Eha, the 4 heavenly ones, as they began to be known. It was Liliu, who was 36, their sister, Like, who was 23, and their youngest brother, Leleohoku, 20, who was named heir apparent. The crown of the kingdom is for the 4 ruling chiefs. This royal flag is theirs, long may it wave. Liliu rejoiced soon after in a song, Kaha Kalana, the flag of the crown, soon celebrating their ascension to their rightful place. And how would they not celebrate it? As he made his way around all the islands on the traditional progresses, sometimes with his sisters, the new chief was welcomed by his subjects with such fervor that there was little doubt that the Kalakaua dynasty would be embraced. For Liliu, the change was especially momentous. Both her birth and her Hanai parents were trusted advisors to the royal courts, so she had been close to power her entire life, but she had not actually held any, a pattern that continued after she married John Dominus, who, as a result of his childhood friendships with Kamehameha IV and Kamehameha V, had long been part of their inner circles and was now the governor of Oahu. 12 years into an unhappy childless marriage, living with John and his cold American mother in the Washington Place mansion, always referred to as the governor's house rather than hers, she was now a princess in her own right, a station that must have been difficult even for the dowager Mother Dominus to ignore. Never before was so splendid a display witnessed in these islands. A newspaper wrote about the king's return to Honolulu from Molokai with his wife, Queen Gaellin. Their carriage was draped with flags and drawn by some 50 schoolboys through the street, the Princess Lydia and Governor Dominus following in an open sedan chair, borne on the shoulders of men, while on either side and preceding and following were numerous torchbearers. From the wharf to Iolani Palace, the streets were one blaze of light. Washington Place was so near the palace, Liliu's mother-in-law could hardly have missed the parade. If Liliu was disappointed that she was not to be heir apparent, she also understood it. With her empty marriage and empty womb, she was much less likely than the charming young Leleohoku to produce a successor. And it was the succession, more than any of them individually, that now mattered. In any case, she was not to be overshadowed long, for in the continuing swath of deaths that cut down the Alii, as it did other native Hawaiians,
Leleiohoku died in 1877 at 23, and she became next in line. It was then that she became Leleiokulani, Liliu of the Heavens, a name chosen by her brother to enhance her royal standing. From the moment of Kalakaua's accession, the lives of the siblings were increasingly entwined, for the future of the dynasty and the future of the Hawaiian kingdom were now the same. With the birth of a baby, Ka'iulani Chiliki'like, in 1876, enfolded into the lives of her childless aunt and uncle, as much for the pleasure of her as for an heir, there was hope for the line for another generation, but it was precarious. In spite of marriage and motherhood, Likelike was, it seemed to Liliu and David, reckless, often fleeing her Honolulu household and husband and leaving the care of the precious baby to others, endangering both herself and the family. One of the most frequent themes in family letters in the first years of the dynasty was anxiety. Take good care of yourself and try to avoid anything that could bring on accidents, for we all have our hope in you for the future, Liliu had cautioned Like during her sister's pregnancy. We all felt very anxious about you, and others are just as anxious. If you are ailing at all, always consult a doctor, for we cannot spare you, she reminded her a few years later. This is from the brother. The last week has been one of great anxiety to all of us, owing to the illness of Ka'iulani, Kalakaua wrote Like when Ka'iulani was 4. I must say it was something very serious, and had it not been for the prompt action of the physician and the continuing watchfulness, care, and attention of those in attendance, she would have died. Fortunately, as I write, she is now considered out of danger, or I would have sent the lahula for you. The Queen and I have been out here ever since the child has been ill and do not intend to leave until your return. Fortunately, Lydia came back by the Mokali'i. I have been amusing the baby by buying her curiosities to keep her from despondency. At present, she is comparatively well, but at any time she may have a relapse. With Likelike less than eager for her official duties, her older brother and sister relied principally on each other. Inevitably, the royal siblings had their differences, of which much was made both in the gossip of the day and in subsequent histories. Deeply unlike, yet tightly bound, in many ways closer to one another than either was to anyone else, including their spouses. The king and the crown princess might quarrel one time over a political appointment, another over protocol for a royal procession, yet another over Likelike herself, and still recline comfortably in one another's company at the enormous luau's at the king's boathouse, dance together at his balls at Iolani Palace, and dissect it all thoroughly over breakfast there the next morning. Whatever else might also be happening, their connection to one another and to the responsibility that they alone shared for the preservation of the kingdom and its people was never broken. In 1881, when Kalakaua traveled around the world and Liliuokalani was regent, it was to her that he wrote some of his most serious letters about government, religion, and the ongoing crisis of the Hawaiian people. To save the life of our people is to work and not pray, to find and stop the causes of the death of our people, and not to cry and whine like a child and say to God that it is good, O Lord, that thou hast visited us thus. He wrote her from Cairo in June, after learning of another smallpox epidemic on Oahu. I only wished you were with me. I've gathered so much to advise you and our family in particular, he wrote from London the next month. As for Liliu and her, the love of the man and the love of the office were now so mingled that it would have been hard to say where one ended and the other began. From his swearing in to his death and forever after, she rarely referred to him, even in her diaries, without capitalizing the word king. Ready more? I'd like to read. I'd like to read about the bayonet constitution. Even though it's not the Queen is out of the country when it's going on, but it's so fundamental to everything that happens after. And then I want to read it, and it's also the one piece of this book that I've wanted to or have let be published. So, I mean, it's easier for me to read it from this. This is just the literary magazine of Pacific University where I've been teaching writing for a number of years. So it's just called Bayonets. I really want to stretch.
Do you want to take a little break?
I'm okay if everybody, everybody has to sit so still. Anybody want to move? Anyway. I think it's harder to listen. There's a lot of quotations in here, and I think they'll be obvious with sort of what they are. It's one of the better documented episodes up until that point. I think later, in the period that Tom has written about, there's more documentation, but this is one of the more that I've encountered. So this is much later. On June 30th, 1887, as the heir apparent, Princess Lelio of Gaellin, was awaiting the steamer Servia for her return from London, where together with Queen Gaellin, her brother's wife, she represented the Kingdom of Hawaii at the celebration of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Her brother, King David Kalakaua, by election as well as lineage, the rightful successor to the throne of the Kamehamehas, was confronted at Iolani Palace by 13 determined men, straight from a mass meeting of the country's white-led commercial circles, whose purpose was nothing less than to end the native monarchy and institute a republic to be controlled by themselves. It was a venomous meeting. Shoulder to shoulder in the crowded armory of the Honolulu Rifles, while outside, militia stood ready to provide whatever protection might be needed. One speaker after another denounced the king's, I'm just going to do this, iniquitous misrule and extravagance, and calls for immediate action, whose approval by the assemblage is best seen in its response to the one speaker who wanted to proceed legally. Great uproars and cries of, "No, no, sit down," the record reads. We waited as long as we could stand it, and when our Anglo-Saxon blood could endure it no longer, we screwed our courage to the sticking point and went in for revolution, exulted one of the participants in the meeting a few weeks later. King John and the Magna Carta and the Battle of Bunker Hill were also invoked. The problem with the governance of the kingdom from the point of view of the, quote, revolutionaries, unquote, was the king himself, who under the Constitution granted by King Kamehameha V in 1864 had the sole power both to appoint and dismiss his cabinet members and to veto legislation. Their plan was to present Kalakaua with a set of resolutions from the meeting addressing particular abuses they felt flowed from this autocratic structure. And when he refused, well, every man of us had a rifle and bayonet and 100 rounds of ammunition and was ready, and in some cases eager to use them. Up to that time, it had not entered our plans that the king would yield and thus save his crown, continues the above account. But unexpectedly, he did. Understanding that to get the crown, they would also willingly take his head, he calmly let visitors know that he had substantially complied with their demands already, most importantly, accepting the resignation of his cabinet, including a longtime prime minister they particularly detested, and requesting one of the gentlemen specifically named by the mass meeting to form a new cabinet. Now they were in a quandary. For all the months that their conspiracy against Kalakaua had been in the making, they had taken for granted that the constitution under which they would hold power would be a republican one, that the king was not going away. Astounded and perplexed, they returned to the drawing boards to devise a new document that would accomplish the same ends, but by other means. The constitution with which the new cabinet returned to Kalakaua only 6 days later is the most infamous document in Hawaiian history. It is the edict Liliuokalani was attempting to undo 6 years later when she was overthrown by the same men now presenting it to Kalakaua. Known as the Bayonet Constitution, it was a double coup, in one stroke both undermining the ancient chiefly rights on which the Hawaiian kingdom was based and redefining the very composition of the population the kingdom was understood to include. Not only did it leave the king unable to act independently of the cabinet and the legislature, it opened the suffrage to non-citizens, which together with prohibitive property and income requirements guaranteed that it would be the foreigners of the business community, not native Hawaiians, who would be doing most of the electing. To understand what was at stake in the struggle between king and cabinet, it is necessary to understand that while by this time for many white people the Hawaiian monarchy was little more than a pleasant fiction, for native Hawaiians it was all they had left. A report dated June 30th, 1887, the same day as the mass meeting, puts the native Hawaiian population at 44,232, a decrease of 41% from the 107,954 counted in 1836, the year of the king's birth. The losses were at once personal and universal. Whole families and villages had simply disappeared. Pausing at land he knew well during his royal progress around Oahu after his 1874 accession, Kalakaua, who by that time had lost 6 of his own 9 siblings, seems to have been much affected that there were so few people there to greet him. "Is this all there were left of you?" he asked. His predecessors had been similarly affected. We've heard this actually. Reports of the rapid decimation of the native race caused me a severe pang of sadness, staggering in its intensity, Kamehameha III had told his people in 1842. Kamehameha IV in 1855 says, "The decrease is a subject in comparison with which all others sink into insignificance." That's 1855. To Kalakaua, too, nothing was more important than restoring not only the bodies of the Hawaiian people, but their spirits. His motto, Ho'oulu Wahui, is usually translated increase the nation, but it can also mean inspire the nation. And it was that hope that tied together many of the projects of Kalakaua's administration that his enemies found embarrassing, wasteful, or inconvenient. In the gleaming new Iolani Palace, completed in 1882, they saw mainly reckless expenditure. But they had not traveled around the world as he had the year before, seeing in capitals from Tokyo to London the importance of such an assertive centerpiece in maintaining national pride. In the long public party that was the king's 1883 coronation, they saw mainly a meaningless indulgence made all the more sickening by the command performances of hula, an offense repeated at his 50th birthday 3 years later. But they did not care, as he did, about the deep displacement that had accompanied hula's suppression decades before, nor its centrality to any hope of cultural renewal. In his scheme of uniting Polynesia into a Hawaiian-led federation, they saw him merely irritating the great powers like Germany and Britain, then assigning each other addresses in the Pacific. But what mattered to them were letters to the king from Tahiti and the Gilberts, beseeching their sister Polynesian kingdom to take them under its wings, in preference to the foreigners suddenly showing up on their shores. As long as he used his powers in their interests, the business community accepted the king's authority, in many ways basking in its benefits. But when his attention turned to his own people, they called him a tyrant. Unlike the good counselors, that is, themselves, on whose advice he had traveled to Washington in 1874 to promote the free trade agreement with the United States, on which their prosperity now rested, his later ministers were, in their words, a subservient lot drawn from beyond their social circles, whose expenditures for his fantastic enterprises over those they preferred for roads, landings, and wharves undermined their prosperity. Surely they could find a constitutional principle here. Dear sister, we are just passing through a tremendous crisis, happily averted since Tuesday, 28th of June of last week. Kalakaua wrote Lily O'Kalani on July 5th, 1887, in a note that awaited her in San Francisco. But the king was wrong. The power he had hoped to preserve through his appointment of a new cabinet was already lost. The very day after his wishful messages, the 4 new ministers whose appointment he had hoped would forestall the crisis confronted him with a hastily developed constitution that both he and they knew would mean the end of native rule. Previous Hawaiian constitutions had been granted to all the people by their kings. This one was being dictated by some of the people to the king, and it left the Hawaiians out. This is a quotation from Thurston. Unquestionably, the Constitution was not in accordance with the law, neither was the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. Both were revolutionary documents which had to be forcibly effected and forcibly maintained, wrote one of the leaders of the insurrection, now one of the new ministers, later. But there are revolutions and revolutions. It is true that like the beleaguered despots of their grandiose rhetoric, the king sat isolated in his castle while, quote, the people, quote, controlled the streets. But who exactly were the people? When the king boasted after his return from abroad that unlike the mightier sovereigns he had met on his royal travels, he could mingle with my people without dread, these were hardly the ones he had in mind. No one will ever know the full contents of Kalakaua's heart as he struggled with his 4 white cabinet ministers over the Constitution presented for his signature during the course of that fateful afternoon. What we do know is that he had reason to fear for his life. Outside the palace, his newly resigned prime minister had been dragged from his house by a squad of the Honolulu Rifles and nearly lynched, and the king knew that. Threats of violence were everywhere. This is quoting. The king argued, protested, inquired as to the effect of certain changes, and for considerable periods appeared to be gazing into space and weighing the probabilities of success in the event of a refusal to comply, another of the 4 ministers recounted later. But he can hardly have had any illusions. Even in the meeting, he was not necessarily safe. Quote, more might be written of the arguments made and physical attitudes assumed toward the king by members of the cabinet on that memorable occasion, but let it suffice to say that little was left to the imagination of the hesitating and unwilling sovereign as to what he might expect if he refused the demands then made upon him. The account continues. The last king of Hawaii was a hard man to destroy. In spite of what they liked to believe, at no time had he ever been a creation of the foreigners. From his earliest experiences in the missionary-run boarding school for the children of chiefs, he had understood that their interests in the kingdom were not the same as his own. And though he had successfully accommodated them, particularly in the crucial matter of the reciprocity treaty with the United States, he had never lost his focus on his own people. No one grasped better than Kalakaua the cultural richness of the Hawaiian past, nor its importance for sustaining the natives now. Had our first teachers in the new regime been men of scientific tastes, a great many of the oral traditions might have been collected and preserved, but aiming only at the propagation of their own tenets, the recital of old meles was considered criminal for a period of nearly 20 years, he wrote in 1872, 2 years before becoming king. There was crushed out with a deadly blow the only landmarks of Hawaiian civilization. It was for the Hawaiians that the very things the Haole scorned had been undertaken. For the Hawaiians that he had brought that hula, preserved the last extant Hawaiian creation myth, that told the story of the Hawaiian people from the beginning, compiled the comprehensive collection of legends and myths still on the shelves today. And it was for them he would wish the dynasty to survive. At the same time, he had not been much of a manager. Not personally unscrupulous, none of the charges of corruption against him were ever proven. He was rather indifferent to cost, pursuing his visions and leaving the details to others, while budget outflow continued to exceed inflow in a way that terrified those same Anglo-Saxon hearts. What he was irrepressible. It seems he could not resist a good time. He spills eagerly out of even his most formal photographs, as if neither uniform nor throne can contain either his bulk or his spirits, the very opposite of his sister, whose portraits from a young age seem already almost presciently solemn. That this large-minded, large-hearted native Hawaiian king should be surrendering his chiefly heritage to two Britons, one Canadian, and the grandson of American missionaries is surely one of the world's irreparable wrongs, but that is the story of the Bayonet Constitution. They had arms, and he did not have arms. Danger was imminent. At the very last moment, he called in another official who knew exactly what was happening in the streets and asked him in Hawaiian, "Must I sign?" And the official told him he'd better. David Kalakaua loved being king in the manner of the old Hawaiian kings, but he also loved life, and he was a man as well as a king. He signed. I just thought I want to read one more selection, and it's shorter. It's from another section of the book, whose title you recognize. No, actually not. The section of the book that goes from 1891 to 1895, which has all the major political events, is called 1 Inch Left. And the title comes from a writer in a Hawaiian newspaper in 1891. It's a letter to the Queen. It's an anonymous letter to the Queen, but it is, but it's in the newspaper. It's not a private letter. It says, "There is only 1 inch left, and then the Hawaiian government will be for the Haoles. The Haoles will be the people of Hawaii. There will be no Hawaiians. I feel you are that single inch that is left." And this piece that I'm going to read is after the overthrow. It's January 1895, and it's the day of her arrest and beyond. It's called the late throne of Hawaii, which is a phrase that comes up in the text. So January 1895. The Queen's life was painfully diminished. Not only had she lost the throne, the last lifeline between the Hawaiian people and what came before them, but the succession of events in both Washington and Honolulu in the last 2 years had only further revealed her powerlessness. There were intangible losses too. The gardens around Washington Place were as rich and lush as ever, but they no longer brought her the contentment they always had. And even the songs that had always flowed so naturally from her heart seemed out of reach. For the first time in a long time, she did not write any music. Because of the death threats, she rarely went out in her carriage. Nor did she have many visitors. There were no balls, no parties, no luau's. The former admirers who had clamored for her royal company her entire life now denounced her so luridly it is a wonder they failed to notice the devil with her earlier. And as for her supporters, the closer they came to implementing their plans to restore her by force, the more they stayed away. With police spies across the street recording every arrival and departure, it was safer that day. On Christmas Day, 1894, the Queen and her lady-in-waiting dined alone. Her nerves were also faltering. Throughout the fall, she was treated with a battery-powered electrical device whose intimate placement may have been almost as shocking to her as whatever jolts it administered. But the force of circumstances was greater than the force of the gadget, and her symptoms continued. Between what had happened in Hawaii already, what was happening now, and what she knew was going to happen, it is hardly surprising that the Queen had palpitations. The royalists were tired of waiting. She had discouraged the preparations of some of her followers while encouraging others, but for the most part they were moving forward on their own. In December 1894, as rumors of impending rebellion multiplied, one of his spies told the provisional government, the Republic's marshal, that the Queen has no control over this, nor will she be consulted on the matter. The Queen never saw those words, but if she had, she would have had to agree. Right next door to Washington Place was the Anglican Church, and it was in one of its school buildings that Lelio Kalani slept on January 7th, 1895, the day the insurrection finally began, slipping through the fence that separated the two properties and trusting in the discretion of its sympathetic nuns. Her movements during that next dangerous week are largely unknowable, either never confided to paper in the first place, or seen only in the tainted testimonies of the trials that followed. But her situation, to say the least, was precarious. The plan was that armed natives coming in from Diamond Head would set off an uprising in town, seize key buildings, and force the Republic's surrender. But in practice, it was the opposite. Troops surprising the rebels at their gathering point before they had even started out, and chasing them into the surrounding mountains, where most quickly surrendered. A white man and a few natives had been killed, others hurt. Within hours, the city was under martial law. Everything shut down. The government rounding up anyone thought to be associated with the royalists. 20 or 30 men their first sweep, more every day. The annexationists blamed the Queen herself. From a poster that went up all over town, the poster says, "For her bloodthirsty and criminal nature, as well as her role in the conspiracy, we ask her immediate arrest and imprisonment like any other common criminal." There's a petition, actually, that went around all over town. But the government situation was also precarious. Not only were there still rebels in the mountains, but with information emerging only in bits from the various prisoners, the scope of the rebellion was not yet fully known. Nothing reveals more about the true state of relations between natives and whites 2 years after the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy than the minutes of the Executive Council as it debated the staging of the Queen's arrest. And you can go over here and read those. So these are all going to be quotes. So-and-so spoke in favor of arresting her at once, using the arguments that the natives still looked upon her as their Alii, but if she was arrested like an ordinary conspirator, it would remove that impression from the native mind. That's one entry. Another so-and-so was against it because, quote, the troops were all still in the hills, and if she did still have a following in the city, it would be better to have troops centered here when the arrest was made. So-and-so number 3 did not know what effect her arrest would have on the natives. If a quieting effect, well and good. If it would arouse them, he was against it. So-and-so 4 also did not know what effect her arrest would have upon the natives, but was positive that it would create great satisfaction among the supporters of the government. Besides the risks of both further inciting the natives and antagonizing American and British opinion, which, as yet another of the members of the Executive Council put it, still had a certain amount of sentiment in regard to her, the Executive Council faced an additional quandary in the timing of the Queen's arrest and absence of evidence of her complicity. However unjust their very existence might seem in the minds of the royalists, in their own minds they were models of legal decorum. A first search of Washington Place had turned up a collection of antique weapons belonging to John Dominus, but it was hardly enough. With the capture on January 14th of the captain of the Queen's Guards, Sam Noline, who immediately agreed to cooperate, they knew they could get what they wanted. At 9:50 a.m. on January 16th, 1895, 9 days after the insurrection started, they made their move. photograph of Leo Kalani's arrest is taken about a half hour later. It is a newspaper photo. You've all seen it. She sees the photographer take it, and not very clear, but it practically weeps with the pain of the moment. The Queen at the bottom of the palace steps, staring up at the building she has not been in for so long. The center of the monarchy, of all Honolulu. The struggle to accept her fall, perhaps hinted by an odd tilt of her body, as if her feet are unwilling to take her where her head knows she must go. The grounds, not shown in this photograph, are filled with artillery and soldiers. She has just driven through a military campground. Inside is the great koa staircase that once separated the ceremonial and the private floors of the royal headquarters. And in the hall at its top, she sees a life-size portrait of herself as queen, somehow overlooked in the takeover. And it is only then that she almost cries, wiping away a few tears with a handkerchief, while members of the government working in the converted bedrooms crowd their doorways and watch. A few more paces, and she is officially delivered to her chambers. Beset as she has been in the 2 years since the overthrow, she was still, nonetheless, a free woman. Now she is a prisoner. Everything she reads, writes, wears, and eats is to be monitored and inspected by the guards outside her door and subject to the judgment of the authorities higher up. She is particularly worried about her health. I was very weak and threatened with paralysis, she wrote in notes made a few weeks later, and it clearly showed because her doctor would be allowed to come in daily. She is also worried about her lady-in-waiting, so anxious about her husband, a prisoner, that the Queen has practically to attend to her as much as the other way around. A sigh, and a sigh, Leo Kalani remembered she heard all through their first sleepless night. When morning came, we were not much better in spirits or in health. She heard, too, the rattling of arms and the beating of drums every now and then from below. As ominous as it is to be in that room, however, what is more ominous is taking place elsewhere. Washington Place is now conquered territory. On the day of my departure, scarcely an hour passed before the Chief Justice came to search my house, whether for paper or firearms, making a thorough overhauling of all my bureaus, wardrobes, and shoeboxes, and leaving articles strewn over the place, she wrote, all over the place. The next day, everyone living there is arrested, along with the retainers on her other properties, about 40 people, joining the prisoners already crowded into the police station or the reef. It is January 17th, 1895, 2 years to the day since she was driven from office. An anniversary cheered by the government, which, bypassing the civil courts, whose juries include natives, has ordered a hand-picked military commission to open its courts-martial that very day. The day after that, the commission begins hearing cases, starting with that of the former guard Sam Noline, whose confessions have made him the centerpiece of the prosecution, and who, along with 2 others, pleads guilty to charges of treason. More cases are to follow, and more and more and more. The Queen's chambers are directly above the throne room, where the government is pointedly holding the trials. In spite of her confinement, a few people are allowed to come and go from her room for specific purposes, and however softly, they talk. Treason carries the death penalty. Riding in the carriage on the short drive from Washington Place to the palace on the day of her arrest, the Queen had wondered in my mind what they were going to do with me. But it is not only herself that she is wondering about now. Her supporters are subject to the verdicts of a hostile tribunal with rules invented specifically for this occasion, and to the judgments of a vengeful city. What was going to happen to them? The answer was that they were going to die by hanging. Honolulu was in a panic. The feeling is that we have had a very narrow escape from a desperate encounter, a member of the government wrote a friend. There is the most intense feeling amongst the better classes of the community that some capital sentences should be imposed and carried out. It is difficult to give you an adequate idea of this intensity, especially among wives and mothers. Shortly after the first trials, it was hinted to the Queen by one of the visitors to her chambers that it was possible a formal abdication would help soothe those better classes. It was not an official offer, only some lawyerly thinking. Practically, such an act might be meaningless because as far as the government was concerned, she had abdicated when she yielded in 1893, so was already no longer queen. But with bargaining of all these cases going on downstairs night and day, as the prosecutor sorted the cases out, perhaps the Queen could be bargained too. The Queen's position was the opposite. She had yielded, she will know well, only temporarily, and to the United States, not to this illegitimate government which had claimed to succeed her. But she agreed to think about it, and a lawyer sent around a few drafts. The abdication signed by Liliuokalani after a week's imprisonment is the most abject political document to which she would ever put her name, the word she uses herself in the autobiography written a few years later. Insulting, she also calls it. It twice calls the people who supported her misguided, names the Republic, quote, the only lawful government of the Hawaiian Islands, and declares, quote, the late Hawaiian monarchy is finally and forever ended. In so many ways, it pays inadvertent homage to the solidity with which it once existed. It is also intrusive, combining the termination of the monarchy as an institution with so many shades of renunciation personal to the Queen herself, that its reading alone would have had to and did cause pain. I hereby, without any mental reservation or modification, fully, finally, unequivocally, irrevocably, and forever abdicate, renounce, and release unto the government of the Republic of Hawaii and its legitimate successors forever all claims or pretensions whatsoever to the late throne of Hawaii, she was made to say. Notwithstanding the gossip about the seeming self-interest of her capitulation, the Queen thought that it would save the lives of those imprisoned for treason. For myself, I would have chosen death rather than to have signed it, she wrote in the autobiography, and I believe her. Death was no stranger to Liliuokalani. She had lived with it intimately her entire life, as had every other native Hawaiian. One of only 2 left of the 13 students deemed eligible to rule who had entered the Chief Children's School 50 years before. The last of her own royal brothers and sisters. She did not necessarily long to go on. What she did want was to prevent the deaths of any of her people that might be possible to save. The same wish that had guided much of the course of her reign in the first place, as it had of her brothers before her, and of the late Kamehamehas before them, including the decisions that led to her downfall. I still believe that murder was the alternative, she would write. Among the more disturbing aspects of this humbling of Liliuokalani is how little it actually mattered, and not only because more was to come. According to the rules of storytelling, the collision of so many interests and passions against the background of the gallows ought rightfully to be a climax, but it was not. It cannot be conceded that such rights and claims as you now voluntarily relinquish have had any legal existence since January 14, 1893, the Republic's Attorney General was quick to tell her. Many Hawaiians also ignored it. To them, Liliuokalani was not only a queen, she was a chief, and a chief could not be removed by a piece of paper. There was a deeper authority than politics. On January 24th, 1895, the day she signed the statement, perhaps even as she was signing it, I don't know if you know this story, but I don't know why this is an important story. She says she's signing the paper. It's a quote. The court was startled by the fall upon the table of a massive bar of plaster from the lofty ceiling of the throne room, 9 feet long, precisely fitting the length of it. It was hearing the cases of the first large group of natives charged with treason at the time. Okay, everybody's sitting there in the throne room. The Queen is above the throne room, signing this paper, and this chunk of plaster, exactly fitting this table, crashes down on it. Some thought the old kahunas must be working. must be watching. So unaffected were many natives by the abdication that the government translated the statement, which was in English, into Hawaiian on a special flyer with a large black Hawaiian headline reading, "Pay attention, you Hawaiian people, stop your illusions." But their trust continued. A few months later, an American correspondent reported from Honolulu that her act made no difference in the native loyalty to the monarchy. So that's all I'm going to read from my book. But I want to close with something from, I want to close in the Queen's voice, and not my own. And just maybe remind you of where I started with, sort of how complicated it is to, how complicated a life is in relation to what you can do on a page, and how you separate it. And this is in a way it's a random letter. It's not a well-known letter. It's a random time in a way. It's March 5th, 1901, but it has a phrase in it that's stuck in my mind. So it's 1901. You know, many things have happened, but annexation has happened. She still has many trips back and forth to Washington ahead of her. But at the moment she's home. It has a phrase in it that stayed with me. The phrase here is, "You ask if I am happy." And
after she was released, she was under house arrest for 6 years?
No,
No?
just a matter of just months.
House arrest?
Yeah, January to September, I think.
Yep.
Yeah. No, it wasn't.
So the setting in 1901, what was it like?
Oh, she's home. She's she had been traveling back and forth. So this is from Washington Place. We don't know. No one knows. I don't think anyone knows. I certainly don't know who this letter is to. It's just my very dear friend. And I guess it's about complexity. It's about life not being only the dramatic story that we remember. Here. My very dear friend, your delightful letter of the 23rd of January has been received. In fact, it's been in my possession a whole month. But my time has been so occupied with business that before I was aware, time had slipped away, and so rapidly. Though I often think of you and read your letters over and over and think of those days gone by and of our dear ones who were in that better land only gone before us. Well, the present is what we have to attend to, and in the absence of that dear one, all complications of this life fall back on me. I have to attend to all matters myself. Although I have an agent, it is more satisfactory to attend to them myself. You ask if I am happy. Well, yes. I do not trouble myself with the affairs of others, but I have the love of my people, and I am happy in the thought and knowledge of it. But there has been a division in this way. Some became Republicans, others Democrats, and the majority became Home Rule independents. They all love me, but you know I'm out of politics, and that is where the trouble is. It comes in different groups. I make light of it. There are some who want to take the little I have, and there are some who want my property, and go to a judge to serve an injunction on me, and I cannot do what I want with what is my own. Another man brings a summons from the judge that I should not sell land for my own property because it belongs to the territory of Hawaii. Now, my friend, haven't I enough on my hands? Then all I have is mortgage because I could not pay expenses after the overthrow of my government by the missionaries. But with all these troubles, my Maker has been good to me, for I have not suffered in spirit, and when night comes on, my sleep is undisturbed, for I do not lay any weight on the goods of this world, at least not enough to make me worry. We're having delightful weather, so cool and pleasant, that from appearances we may have a cone of storm. But for it to rain while the sun shines, the old ones say, that these showers are for strewing the petals of the flowers of the mountain apples, preparatory to the coming of the fruit, then another shower for the opening of it. It is so very poetical, the idea is. That's where the letter stops.
echo that is where I'm gonna stop. Bless you.
Open it up to questions. I'm still working with my anger, but go ahead.
Which part which part is the most?
Almost everything.
Almost everything.
Almost everything that you discussed. I mean, not you, obviously, at the
Yeah, it's not.
recounting of the event. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
different.
Yes, you know, you mentioned about, I think during talking about, and it was so much, and it was so rich and so moving, but it was sort of, they used the word tyrant, and I think they talked about Kalakaua as some aspect of tyranny that the ones, his detractors, said.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of Ilani Irwin's recounting of the Queen and she in St. Andrew's Cathedral. She's sitting in the front, and the new American bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church that's in my view ousted the English bishop.
Mm-hmm.
He says how nice it is that the tyranny has ended and that you are now a part of the United States of America. And he said it in the pulpit with the Queen standing in front, and it's raw. All that you've said is like a raw, and it rubs a nerve, but it's so illuminating, and so I thank you. But that's what made me think of that. I've not forgotten. I've just boiled when I...
Does Irwin say, did she make any further comment about it? Do you remember?
I just remember that one comment that the Queen, she said that the Queen looked ahead and made no facial recognition, said no word, that she was gravely insulted by this sermonizing of this new bishop, Rusterick, I think he was called.
Mm-hmm.
And that came to mind when you used the word tyrant.
Mm-hmm. I think she must have had that experience a lot. The one.
We must all remember that in 1839, Hawaii became a constitutional monarchy. So the monarch was still another job. Now, if Queen Elizabeth abdicated today, does the UK fall apart? No.
Mm-hmm.
So she abdicated her position, but her use of regal discretion is always in question. But in Buddhist axiom, what goes around comes around. 1980, the United States Embassy in Tehran was under siege. And for 444 days, the only water they had at the United States Embassy in Tehran was in a swimming pool. All the chlorine, chemicals, and whatever is in the swimming pool. Did that for cooking, eating, bathing, and everything else. So the United States paid a debt. Now, as far as King Kalakaua is concerned, he was assassinated because on a hot summer night in San Francisco at the Palace Hotel, he was served a nice cold drink mixed with broken glass. He drank it and he was assassinated. But during the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong did the same thing to the United States troopers. What goes around comes around.